There was a man standing at a crossroads in the south of Mississippi. It was night, the air was thick with heat, and he was carrying a guitar he barely knew how to play. According to the legend, he stood there until someone appeared, tuned his instrument, showed him a few chords, and vanished. That man was Robert Johnson. And what he supposedly learned that night would become one of the most influential sounds the world has ever heard. The story of the blues does not begin at a crossroads. It begins much earlier, on a continent that was plundered, in bodies that were put in chains, in voices that had nothing left but the voice itself. It begins in the cotton fields of the American South, where African and African American men and women worked under an unforgiving sun, without freedom, without rights, without any promise of a future. And yet they sang. They did not sing out of joy, they sang to endure. They sang to communicate among themselves without the overseer's understanding. They sang so they would not forget where they came from. Those work songs, those calls and responses that travelled across the fields, those melodies carrying as much pain as resistance, are the seed of everything that would follow. The blues was not born as a musical genre, it was born as a human necessity. In English, the word blues carries a weight that goes beyond simple sadness. Having the blues means being in that grey place where the body keeps going, but the soul feels heavy. It is exhaustion that cannot quite be explained. It is loss, abandonment, the kind of injustice that settles into your bones. What African American musicians in the South did was take that internal state and turn it into sound. Not to complain, to transform it. The blues emerged with full force in the Mississippi Delta, a flat, humid, and impoverished region in the Deep South, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There, in that landscape of plantations and poverty, a musical form took shape that had simple rules but enormous depth. 3 chords, a structure that repeats, a voice that asks a question and the instrument that answers, or the other way around. That is the blues in its most stripped-down form. The guitar became the central instrument of the blues for a reason. It was affordable, portable, and expressive. A musician could play it alone, on a porch, on a street corner, in a run-down bar. And he could make it sound almost like an extension of the human voice. The techniques blues guitarists developed, the slide, which involves dragging a metal or glass object across the strings to produce that weeping, fractured tone, the vibrato, the string bends that push a note upward until it trembles as if it might break. All of it was chasing one single thing, the voice, raw emotion. But the blues did not all sound the same. From the beginning, there were variations. Delta blues, the kind that came out of Mississippi with figures like Charlie Patton, Son House, and Robert Johnson himself, was rough, urgent, and solitary. It had something almost primal about it, something that went straight to the gut. Further north, in Chicago, the blues found the city. African Americans migrated in massive numbers toward the north during the early decades of the 20th century, fleeing segregation and looking for work in the factories. They brought their music with them, and that music changed when it came into contact with electricity, with packed bars, with urban life. The electric Chicago blues of Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf was harder, denser, more collective. The plugged-in guitar growled, the harmonica howled, and the voice had to fight for its space. There was also Texas blues, smoother and more melodic. Memphis blues, with stronger influences from soul and gospel. Every city, every region left its mark. But all of them shared that same core. Unadorned emotion, brutal honesty, a structure that circles back on itself like a thought you cannot shake. That repeating structure so central to the blues has a name, the 12-bar blues. It is a chord progression that moves in cycles, and it has something almost hypnotic about it. It is not monotony. It is more like breathing, like a heartbeat. Each pass over the same chords is another opportunity for the voice to say something different, for the guitar to explore a new corner, for the emotion to keep deepening. The blues does not move in a straight line, it spirals. And in that spiral there is something that transcends time and geography. When B.B. King played his guitar, the one he called Lucille, every single note was a conversation. When Bessie Smith sang in the 1920s, with a voice that filled entire theatres without a microphone, she was saying things that words alone could not hold. The blues has always been exactly that, what remains when ordinary language is not enough. You cannot understand the history of 20th century popular music without the blues. Rock and roll does not exist without the blues. Chuck Berry took the blues and sped it up. Elvis Presley took the blues and brought it to white radio. The Rolling Stones travelled to Chicago to learn from their blues heroes and carried that sound back to Europe. Led Zeppelin built their entire sonic world on blues structures and textures. Eric Clapton spent years studying Robert Johnson the way someone studies a sacred text. The blues is not a historical footnote to rock. It is its backbone. Jazz also drew from the blues from the very beginning. The musicians in New Orleans who were inventing jazz in the early 20th century understood that relationship between pain and improvisation, between emotion and technique. The blues gave them permission to feel while they played, to use their instrument as an extension of their inner state. That never left jazz. When Miles Davis held a long, muted note in the air, there was blues in that gesture. Soul, funk, rhythm and blues, hip-hop, and even certain corners of modern pop carry pieces of the blues in their DNA. It is not always obvious. There is not always a slide guitar or a 12-bar progression. But there is an attitude, a way of relating to emotion, of not hiding it, of putting it at the center and letting it breathe. That comes from the blues. What makes the blues so enduring is not technical complexity, it is honesty. In a world where popular music tends to be polished, produced, and engineered to sound perfect, the blues remains imperfect on purpose. A voice that cracks at exactly the right moment is not a mistake, it is the truth. A guitarist who leaves a note unresolved, hanging in the air like an unanswered question, is not being careless. He is saying something that can only be said that way. There is a principle at the heart of the blues that its creators understood long before anyone put it into words. Shared pain becomes lighter. When someone hears a blues song and feels that the voice singing is describing exactly what they are living through, something shifts. The problem does not disappear, the wound does not heal, but you are no longer alone in that dark place. And in the context where the blues was born, inside a community that had been systematically stripped of almost everything, that was an enormous act of resistance. The blues survived because it was authentic from the very first moment. It was not born to entertain anyone outside the community that created it. It was not born to be sold. It was born because there was something that needed to be said, and words alone were not enough. Music could go where language could not. When Robert Johnson recorded his songs in 1936 and 1937, in 2 sessions held in hotel rooms in Texas, he was not thinking about posterity. He had no idea that decades later his recordings would be studied, revered, and reinterpreted by musicians around the world. He died the following year at 27, under circumstances that were never fully explained. But what he left on those 78 RPM records was an entire universe, a way of understanding the relationship between human suffering and musical beauty that remains just as true today as the day he recorded it. The blues is the oldest language of modern popular music. It is the place where everything began to connect, where the human voice discovered it could say more than words aloud, where an instrument could weep, laugh, plead, and defy all within the same chord, where pain, instead of destroying, built something the world has never been able to stop listening to.